Well, hi everyone, welcome. Great to see so many of our students and alumni starting to log on. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Molly Tobin. I'm the Director of Professional Programs here at the Alexander Hamilton Society. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, the Alexander Hamilton Society, AHS, is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization, seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security careers, imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We primarily operate on college campuses across the country. We now have over 1,500 alumni, many of whom are working in the foreign policy and national security space. If you're interested in learning more about what we do and get involved, please visit us at our website, alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we would love to connect with you. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome as part of our America's Role in the World book series, Dr. Leon Aron. Leon Aron was born in Moscow, came to the United States as a refugee in 1978, and he's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He studies Russian domestic and foreign policy, U.S.-Russian relations, and the economic, social, and cultural aspects of Russia's post-Soviet evolution. From 2014 to 2020, Dr. Aron was a governor of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees the operations of several international broadcasting outlets, including Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. From 1990 to 2004, he was a panelist on Looking from America, a weekly VOA Russian language radio and television show. Dr. Aron has taught at Georgetown University and has received the U.S. Institute of Peace's Peace Fellowship. In 2011 to 2012, he was co-chairman of the Russia Advisory Group of Governor Romney's presidential election campaign. He is also a prolific writer and editor, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today on his latest book, Riding the Tiger, right here, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the Uses of War. Dr. Aron, thank you for joining us today, and I just want to note for our audience that we'll save time for audience questions towards the end, but if a question does come up while we're chatting, that everyone should feel free to put that in the Q&A box. I want to jump in and sort of start by talking about something that you write about in the introduction of your book regarding the Ukraine invasion. And you write, "We were wrong for the right reasons." Can you talk about the calculation you had made as to why Russia would not invade Ukraine 2 years ago and why Putin made a different calculation? And how has your assessment sort of changed in the last 2 years, if at all, since the start of the war?
A very good question. That leads to quite a can of worms. So I was not the only one. It emerges that the general staff of the Ukrainian army also did not believe until the last minute. And the reason is we operated within the normal rationality. Invading invading Europe's second largest country, 40 million people, moreover with a history of several ages of fierce resistance and very courageous partisan or guerrilla warfare against all sorts of enemies, the Poles, the Germans, the Soviets, then the Soviets again, then the Nazis. Ukrainians are very, very much free-loving people and freedom-loving people. And so it's a vast country, and even if at that time, it was a possibility that Russia will win the war very quickly. How do you, the calculations? I mean, you would have to keep at least 500,000 soldiers, which is the entire Russian army, to keep Ukraine at peace, because there was no doubt that there'll be a fierce underground resistance, fierce guerrilla warfare. Well, as you probably saw in the last chapter of the book, operating on the basis of the normal rationality apparently no longer applies to Putin. It is not to say that he's mad in the sort of clinical sense. It is to say that he had joined a very exclusive, rather evil club of those whom I call people that I call them utopians, and not the benign socialist utopians, but utopians in the sense that the only basis for their actions are their own volitions, at their own emotions, at their own instincts. They believe that, to quote the famous pro-Nazi documentary by Leni Riefenstahl, they believe in the triumph of will. Triumph of will over what? Over reality. In other words, we will bend reality. We don't care about what the simple mortals consider reality. We operate on a different plane. And I used examples of Hitler declaring war on the United States, Japan bombing Pearl Harbor, Saddam Hussein invading Iran, a country much larger, while most of his population were of the same religion, the Shiites, as those of Iran. You could multiply those examples. And so that was the reason why we thought that Putin would not invade, and which is why now I gave you the reasons to revise that calculation. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that being right for the wrong reason is that just as we suspected, it was a mad calculation. It was or a horrific miscalculation. He is stuck in Ukraine. That was, in other words, what was obvious to us became reality. He is stuck in Ukraine, and we could get further in the conversation of how desperate he is to get out. But now he has to have a victory or a semblance of victory.
So I want to sort of zoom out. So you really, the book is divided into 5 different themes or sections, if you will. And you start with really a deep dive on Putin and understanding the Russian state and his image. You sort of paint this picture of Putin's journey in positioning himself as a Russian patriot, but first and foremost, you're right, he's a Soviet patriot. Can you speak to how Putin has used his power in the last 2 decades to this desire to restore the Soviet conception of patriotism and statism?
So yes, that's absolutely true. Putin's formative years, and actually the majority of his years on this planet, are those that he spent in the Soviet Union, and certainly most formative years. His growing up in Leningrad, and then his years in the university, then the KGB, of course, part of the administration of the at that time already St. Petersburg mayor, moving to Moscow. So it's not a full-blown restoration. Great revolutions generally follow by restorations. I think sometimes it's useful to conceptualize the Putin regime as a restorationist regime. And those regimes never really go back all the way. I mean, you could look at the French Revolution, the British Revolution. They preserve some, and of course Putin very skillfully. I mean, he did not go, for example, to renationalizing or resocializing property. He actually is a firm believer in a guided kind of Chinese-style capitalism, where, and we can talk about that later, where in essence the owners of property don't really own it; they manage it on behalf of the state. But so long as they believe, so long as they behave politically, they could enjoy their wealth, and they're left alone. But what he started, and I assume that this really took the first 4 years. That is his first presidential term, from 2000 to 2004. He began one by one, recover the assets, economic, political, cultural, social assets lost in the Soviet collapse. What I mean by that is, of course, what Lenin called the commanding heights of the economy, oil and gas, and he destroyed or reappropriated or renationalized Russia's best and largest modern oil company, Yukos, and sent its owner for almost 15 years in jail. He then recovered mass media, not by jailing anybody, but by changing ownership, sometimes several times. Although in the case of some television owners. He was rather more direct with Vladimir Gusinsky and Boris Berezovsky. I mean, one was essentially threatened with a jail term, the other was forced to immigrate, and their media companies were taken over. So one by one, he restored, he recovered for his state what the Soviet state had lost in its collapse. And then, and here I'll just make an introduction, and because we have a lot to talk about. And then in his third term, when he returned after the placeholding by Dmitry Medvedev in 2012, he turned to what to him became the largest asset to recover, and that is Soviet geopolitical position. In other words, he decided, unless he had had it in mind all along, but did not have enough wherewithal or power or some other assets, to return to Russia the Soviet Union's position as a superpower, as a counterbalance to the United States. You know, as all Soviet and post-Soviet leaders, Putin is obsessed with the United States. Ultimately, that's the only country that counts for the Russians, both leaders and the people. And so this is where it all began in his third term. In 2012, there followed the capture of Crimea, which is restoring the tangible asset of the Soviet Union, and then, of course, led to the invasion of Ukraine.
So on that bit with the United States, I mean, and obviously the title of our series is America's Role in the World. And so how does the US contend with Putin's concept of sovereignty, especially when so many of his charges are that the US is waging some sort of cultural war against Russia or the Russian people?
Yes, the cultural war, goodness. Completely, I mean, completely outrageous, completely, you know, unfounded accusations. There's not much that the US can do. I mean, this is, in many ways, these are ravings of a lunatic. I mean, he tries to persuade, and apparently succeeding to some extent, tries to persuade the Russian people that the US is there to not just, you know, destroy the Russian state, but destroy the soul of the Russian people. Its culture, it's even language. I mean, where does he take this? So there isn't much. I mean, you can't refute one by one these accusations. It will take you hours, and probably does not persuade anyone. So unfortunately, there's very little we can do. There is a you know, as you mentioned, I was fortunate to be appointed by President Obama to be the on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and got to know the immense work that's done, not just by the Russian services, of course, but you know, by Radio Free Cuba, Radio Asia, and so on and so forth. This is probably, you know, one of the answers that is without compromising our journalistic integrity, continue to essentially broadcast in every possible way, electronically, in some cases radio actually better. For example, in Crimea, occupied by the Russians, they used to listen in cars driving because otherwise it's dangerous, somebody might overhear. They used to listen, and probably still do, to the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Beyond that, it's, you know, it's probably hopeless.
So on that same sort of line of thought, I mean, it feels like any internal issues in Russia, Putin will blame the United States for sort of any internal problems as subversion by the US. And so how do you think the US adapts to deal with that reality? I mean, does the US need this sort of drop the act moment if the reality is the US sort of gets blamed either way?
Yeah, I think the latter. at this point, the U.S. is a bogeyman. The U.S. is a bugbear. I mean, how do you deal with aspects of, I don't know, Nazi propaganda? So it's no matter what we do or say, it will be distorted by the Kremlin, because the idea is to keep going that furnace of militarized patriotism that I described in the book.
So looking at Putin's leadership, which you delve into a lot in the beginning of the book in terms of his image, obviously it's been in the news a lot last month. Obviously last month, Alexei Navalny died. What is there to learn from Navalny's legacy and what that means for the future, particularly challenges to Putin's leadership?
What do we learn from where? From Alexei Navalny's death?
Yeah.
Well, the main conclusion from this tragedy is that it belies the sort of the symbols, the triumphant music that's emanating from the Kremlin. Oh, speaking of which, Putin is approaching quickly the Soviet and North Korean results in the elections. It's now 88%. Soon it will be 105%. 6 years from now, he will be a rather elderly man, and probably 106% would not strike him as being odd. So he is. So in one of the articles I wrote about this, I said it's strange that, repugnant as they were, the Soviet regimes and the South African apartheid regimes, while incarcerating and torturing their major opponents, still kept Andrei Sakharov and Nelson Mandela alive. They were more confident than Putin's regime. So I think this is, as they say, this is to me the biggest take home, as they say, of Navalny's death. There's no doubt that Navalny would be considered national hero, and as somebody's a national hero, and as somebody said, there'll be memorials and statues of him all over post-Putin Russia. And of course, his funeral itself became a cause of demonstrations, essentially, against the regime. And people did it quite heroically because, undoubtedly they were filmed, and probably with the application of the Kremlin's big buddies from China. I'm talking about the application of the facial recognition technology and whatnot, and yet people still turned out. So there you are. If the regime that confident, if Putin so beloved, why give Navalny first of all that immense term of 30 years, which, by the way, is now beyond what people got in Stalin's Gulag. And another, I didn't know Navalny, but I know another national hero, Vladimir Karamurza, very well. He's a personal friend, and he is serving a 25-year sentence, and we're very worried about his health. So why? I mean, so this is a very this is a very it's a regime that does not believe in its own power and its own power, staying power. So there you are.
Well, so because you just mentioned Stalin too, I mean, how should historians and policymakers think about sort of forgetting the history as the generation that suffered under Stalin is replaced by this less personal, more Putin-infected memories? I mean, it's a generational shift here.
Well, it's well managed. In my book, I give examples of essentially a campaign Putin started in 2007, And then when he came back in 2012, and of course this coincided with what I call militarized patriotism, the absorption, or the seizure and absorption of Crimea. Yes, history plays a very important part. Strict from, Orwell's 1984, he who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future. No, I'm sorry, he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. That's exactly right. Putin understands that very well. First, he attacked sort of the multiplicity, essentially the freedom that was inherited from the 1990s, when Russia was the freest in its history. Multiple versions for teachers, for example, high school teachers to choose. And then it was gradually restricted, constricted, and consolidated. And I understand that the latest high school textbook is just, it's well beyond what I studied in Soviet school. It's just, phantasmagorical collection of stories and facts, completely distorted. And so the result of this horrible experiment is still not known. I mean, we don't know what kind of generation will eventually emerge. Those who were, say, again, counting from people who were just beginning their schooling in 2012. So that's already 12 years ago. So probably the first Putin generation is about to graduate high schools and go into colleges. We shall see. I mean, it could also be, sort of the opposite. It could be that they reject all of this, but I believe that a good number of them would be infected by this propaganda.
And can you sort of speak to the attitudes of really parents in Russia who it's their children's generation that is really being militarized, and sort of the attitudes of that generation in Russia?
Well, again, I believe I wrote about that in the dispatch. There were very well covered cases of little boys and girls either screaming out anti-war, and we're talking here grade school or middle school, not even high school. Sort of screaming out in class anti-war slogans, or in the case of one girl, drawing a picture favorable to Ukraine. Well, there are police visits. I mean, so they're immediately reported on by the teachers. There's immediate harassment, and the results could differ. In one case, in the case of that poor girl, they tried to arrest the father, who escaped, and they took the girl into the orphanage. So given this level of sanctions and repression, God knows what they really think. I think most of them keep their heads down and just pretty much as we did in the Soviet days. So don't say anything in school, don't say anything publicly. We can whisper in the kitchen. So that's probably where we are now.
So I want to pivot a little bit. So a big part of the book is you're talking about sort of the first use of nukes, and it's a twofold here, because Putin addressed the Federal Assembly a couple of weeks ago, and I know you have some thoughts on that you want to share, but also in regards to sort of Putin's nuclear posture. And is his nuclear posture an attempt at strategic ambiguity? And how does the US think about that when he hints at nukes?
Yes. Again, there's a chapter of my book titled "Worshipping the Nukes." This is pretty much what it is. Putin is obsessed with Russian nuclear power. He completely, unlike the United States, he completely modernized Russian nuclear forces. The jury is still out on some of the more kind of fantastic and apocalyptic parts of that arsenal, but clearly he is spending as much as needed, as much as they ask him to do. In fact, he admitted that he is stinging nothing. I mean, he is spending without reserve on his nuclear weapon. Unstintingly is the term I was looking for. And he is from that position. There were two reasons for that. First, nuclear or strategic. We talk here about strategic nuclear power. Although there's an interesting sideshow here because given in the first disastrous months of his invasion, there were some rumors of his contemplating tactical nuclear weapons, and one of those rare occasions where we have to probably thank China, which otherwise is a lifeline to Putin's regime and enables him to continue the war. We can talk about this with Xi Jinping kind of putting his foot down and said, Vladimir, no nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And given Putin's total dependence on China, or near total dependence on China economically, on China's buying Russian oil and supplying through third or fourth row of traders, dual technology that Putin desperately needs for conducting his war, he pulled back. But now we're talking about strategic nuclear weapons, and that's of course between Russia and the United States. And there were two reasons. One, remember I told you about the recovery of the assets. This is a key asset. This is in fact Russia's only claim to superpowership. I mean, there's nothing else. When we start digging deeper in the Russian economy, it's still it's a poor country. But if you look at the per capita income, in fact, it's interesting in Putin's last State of Russia address that you mentioned, he suddenly started talking about the poverty in Russia, and of course, the average income. The average annual income is about $10,000, and only 20% of people reach that level and above. So he is so in that respect, brandishing his nukes enables him to raise, in his eyes, to the level of the Soviet leadership. Now, he is, the nuclear blackmail is now acquiring additional importance for him because of the situation in Ukraine, and we can talk about this later. But I think that it gave urgency to this whole issue of the West. I mean, essentially scaring the West. Or trying to scare the West off helping Ukraine, which is not working so far. But the more troubling issue here, and again, we can talk about this, it's in the last chapter of my book, is Putin's engineering a direct confrontation with NATO, and then forcing both the settlement of that confrontation and some sort of settlement in Ukraine, which would be to his liking.
It seems like Putin continues to lower the bar as to what type of conflict would actually beget a first nuclear strike. And has your assessment on his nuclear threshold changed since the invasion of Ukraine?
I'm not sure. As I said, the only new datum there was this rumor of a panicked Putin wanting to strike Ukraine with tactical nuclear weapons. Apparently, this is, as I mentioned, this is for now off the table. Beyond that, again, I talk in my book about some very serious modifications under Putin of the Russian nuclear doctrine. So under the Soviets, and this, of course, goes to, by the way, why it appeared that Putin, if he was indeed a Soviet person, a Soviet leader, would never invade Ukraine, is because all the Politburo members of the late Soviet Union, 70s and 80s, were war veterans, with the exception of Gorbachev, who was too young. And the mantra there was "Лишь бы не было войны," only anything but the war. And so the Soviet nuclear doctrine basically stated that a nuclear war should never be fought, it can never be won, and it can only be used in the context of some sort of a global confrontation, obviously with the United States. Putin, yes, steadily lowered that bar, and in December 2014, he signed a Russian it was called Russian military doctrine, that stated that Russia had the right to, and in fact, Putin keeps repeating that doctrine, including, by the way, in the latest State of Russia address in the past few weeks, that Russia reserves the right to use strategic nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict, and not of a global conventional conflict, but a local conventional conflict, if it is deemed that the very existence, I'm quoting here, the very existence of the state is in danger. Well, who is going to, there's only one man who would decide whether the existence of his regime was in danger, and that's, of course, Putin. And so, yes, this is, we can talk about the Chinese nuclear doctrine, we can talk about the US nuclear doctrine, which is actually not that far from what I just described. But of course, with a big difference that it's a democratic state where the power is dispersed, as opposed to essentially an unlimited ability of one man to push that button in in Russia.
So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, then I'm going to open up to the audience. So if folks have any questions, they should feel free to start dropping them into the Q&A slot there, and then I'll get to them soon. But the last chapter of your book is really an end assessment and a sort of a forecasting. And so what does the US and NATO get wrong about Russian ambitions, and especially how we view NATO's conventional force superiority?
Exactly. That's a very good question. So here's, I guess here I have to go to this scenario. I don't believe that Putin, even though he famously said that if there is a nuclear war, we the Russians will go straight to paradise, while they will, he used the vulgar term, "stokhnut," essentially kick the bucket, without being able to repent. Still, I mean, he did display quite a bit of irrationality in invading Ukraine, but I don't think he's there yet in terms of wanting to fight a strategic nuclear war. So it is instrumental, and that is achieving something that he can call a victory in Ukraine. So he in this scenario, he invades, and it's not a kind of an invasion that would proceed towards the capital of a country, and of course I'm talking about the most vulnerable countries on NATO's eastern flank, and that's the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Likely Estonia and Latvia, because there he has a fig leaf of helping ethnic Russians, who are about a quarter of population in both Latvia and Estonia. And the problem with so his again, as I imagine it, his plan would be to try to get out of Ukraine, meaning with some sort of a victory, or truce that would leave him essentially with everything that he acquired, by provoking a crisis attacking a vulnerable NATO country, small on the eastern flank, and then, essentially bringing the country, bringing Russia and the US to the brink of strategic nuclear war, because, as you know, Article 5 of the NATO Charter postulates that an attack on one is an attack on everybody, and of course, everybody means the US with its nuclear umbrella. And bringing the world to this brink of a nuclear, essentially Armageddon, and then stepping back and saying, "Oh well, I'm sorry, this is madness. Let's just settle it." But as part of the settlement, of course, I even have a term for him, and it's an overall settlement or general settlement. That includes Ukraine. Incidentally, while we're on the subject, he said something very interesting in that State of Russia address. I wrote about this too. For the first time, he invoked Russian nuclear weapons many times and threatened and brandished them, trying to scare the West. But this is the first time where he, in the context of threatening to exit the New START agreement, the Obama-Medvedev agreement of 2011, the last, by the way, remaining of the network of nuclear agreements and limitations and inspections. One by one, he destroyed them all and exited from them. He said, "Oh, you Americans, you want to continue keep us within this sort of more or less, reciprocal strategic regime, and look what you're doing to us in Ukraine." In fact, he specifically said, "You want to keep us strategically within your, within the mutually restraining framework, while you declare that you are after Russia's strategic defeat in Ukraine." This is what he said. And to me, this has sounded very disturbing, although as an author, I was a bit gratified, because that sort of went along with my scenario. For the first time, he tied at this point, the US-Russian nuclear strategic framework to the war in Ukraine. And in essence saying, "You're not helping me to, get out of Ukraine. I'm not helping you with arms control." But the problem is that I think it's only the beginning. I think it's only the first step. I think, as seemed, right at the time, and indeed, obviously the Biden administration or any other U.S. administration is not going to say, "Oh goodness, you threaten us with exiting from a strategic arms control. We're going to give up on Ukraine." That did not happen, but this is the first step. And so the ultimate measure is the one that I described in the last chapter. And the problem there, as you quite correctly pointed out, is that when there was an agreement between the Soviet Union and the Western powers on the expansion of NATO, somebody, and I know the name of that diplomat, literally improvised the conditions. And the conditions were no strategically significant forces of NATO are going to be deployed on the Russian border. And NATO, despite all this hullabaloo of, Putin's, we're being threatened, or, NATO is about to attack us, it's laughable. In my last chapter, I have statistics. I mean, until actually, even after the invasion, the first invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, if you look at NATO forces in the Baltics, it's scary. I mean, there were rotating battalions. You're talking, 1,000 men, right, and women, with no air power, no tanks, no significant artillery, no air defenses. It was purely, again, it was at that time designed as they like to say, as a kind of a trigger, as something that you touch and you trigger an explosion, and the problem with that is that this is way outdated. You don't need this kind of trigger. Of course, Putin will step over it, given what I mean. He stepped over it in Ukraine, although it was not a direct confrontation with NATO. So the Estonian president quite rightly has been raising alarm over this, and she said a minimum of a NATO division that's 10,000 to 12,000 men with artillery, with air defenses, with fighter jets, with tanks. That's something that would give us some assurance. Otherwise, as I quote her in my book, we'll be wiped out. So I think NATO is getting there, but I don't see any other explanation except that they're sort of, democratic societies are bound by law, and so they try to abide by that commitment, not to deploy, significant forces on the Russian border. And also, believe it or not, there's still this totally irrational, for me, judgment or argument of not provoking Putin, as if he is, as if he requires a provocation in order to do what he has done. And of course, Ukraine is there. So this is where we are. I hope that NATO is waking up. There is some significant. The last time there was some significant deployment of German troops in the Baltics. Maybe the Polish troops are getting stronger. There are I think greater. I mentioned the 82nd Airborne American Division. There are closer deployments of some fairly impressive military assets. But I still think that the Baltics are still vulnerable.
What do you think sort of the priority number one is to disincentivize a smash and grab of the Baltics?
Disincentivize what?
An attempt at a smash and grab from Putin of an occupation of the Baltics. I mean, what's the number one disincentive?
Put 2 divisions in each of those countries. That's, I think, even he. See, the idea here is that, and I actually give even square miles or square kilometers. I mean, he's not going into Riga, and he's not going into Tallinn. I'm talking about specific, very small areas, largely populated by ethnic Russians, right on the Russian border. Something very low-hanging fruit, and it's still something that I think, even with his assets in Ukraine, he can do within hours, and then, well, of course, within a week, NATO could mobilize in such a way as to he wouldn't have a prayer. But again, in this scenario, it will be too late, because he would invoke that Article 28 of the Russian military doctrine. This is Russian territory now. NATO is attacking Russian territory and is threatening the very existence of the Russian state. And so Russia has the right to respond with a strategic nuclear strike.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then there's actually a bunch of questions that have come in. So you had mentioned sort of China before. How has observing Putin's war in Ukraine and the nuclear posturing affected Chinese calculus? Have they learned anything about the resolve of the West?
That is a rhetorical question. Yes, thanks for that softball. Of course, which is an additional layer of as if we need an additional layer. But I mean, on top of the supreme importance of battling away Putin in Ukraine, or resolving it in favor of Ukraine, this is an additional layer there, because if you know, it's obvious, right? If NATO cannot do anything with a relatively small scale invasion of a country in their backyard, what can they do about Taiwan? I published a long piece in Commentary magazine about how Xi Jinping, whether consciously or unconsciously, in his regime building, which of course started 12 years after Putin, 2012 as opposed to 2000, consciously or unconsciously imitated Putin's steps in all sorts of respects. And again, you know, he may not have looked to Putin to imitate, but there's a logic of these regimes as they slide towards the war. And I think the view from Beijing is, which is, by the way, one of the reasons they are a lifeline to Russian economy, is not, you know, they don't want, you know, a nuclear war between Russia and NATO. And as I said, they were pretty firm on Russia's using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, tactical nuclear weapons. But bleeding the West, dispiriting the West, hollowing it out, show it, to use, you know, the Chinese expression, to be a paper tiger, is extremely important. Both symbolically, it's a separate issue, because Xi Jinping is a convinced and ardent Marxist, to show the capitalist West essentially to be devastated or defeated symbolically and on the ground by another power, is very important to him. And so absolutely, a defeat in Ukraine, whatever, you know, however it's couched, and I'm talking about Ukraine's defeat, meaning also, of course, by extension, the West defeat, is definitely going to play a very important role in Xi Jinping's calculus towards Taiwan, which, by the way, he declared several times that an independent Taiwan is in the way of his realizing what he calls the China dream. In other words, again, as with Ukraine, it's an existential challenge to China. Okay, so Putin resolved it by, you know, very direct, crude ways. I think Xi Jinping will try, you know, economic measures, diplomatic measures to force Taiwan into some sort of essentially recognizing Chinese sovereignty. But he, just as Russia could not coexist with a Western-oriented democratic Ukraine, neither can Beijing coexist with a Western-oriented democratic Taiwan. And so the stakes are very high there.
I'm going to shift now to some audience questions. So our first is from one of our professional chapter members. And the question is, in the context of U.S. material support for Ukraine, could you talk about American self-deterrence in providing timely aid, tanks, F-16s arriving late, and whether the Soviet, quote, reflexive control is a better lens for understanding U.S. hesitance? Is Putin's nuclear bluffing a part of the strategy or reflexive control?
I think it probably is both. He is now. The question is the question about sort of Soviet legacy in Putin's thinking. If you could sort of summarize it for me.
Yeah, I think it's sort of looking at U.S. material support for Ukraine. You know, it is looking at reflexive control and the legacy sort of a better lens for understanding U.S. hesitance, or is this just all part of Putin's bluff and his strategy?
And what is the meaning of reflexive control?
Sort of.
Explain to
me. Well, here I'm gonna. Nika, can I unmute you to elaborate a little more? Hold on, 1 second. Nika, I've sort of given you power.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So the Soviet kind of reflexive control and that shaping the kind of utility set of your adversary in a way that you create a reality for them where any decision they make is not the optimal decision for your adversary. And that is this what the nuclear bluffing is aimed to do, to encourage the Americans to deter themselves? Or are the Americans actually just, let's say, not willing to provide as much as quickly to the Ukrainians? So is
Right.
this the
So-
Soviet legacy in Putin's thinking, or is it just us not doing enough fast enough?
So Nick, if I understand you, so reflexive control, essentially what you mean is influencing via symbolic gestures.
Yeah, influencing, let's say, the information environment that the United States is operating in.
Okay, so Russia creates an information environment, and also I would add, symbolic environment to influence American decision making vis-a-vis Ukraine. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes.
Okay, well, I mean, definitely, it's of course, and it works. You know that there are certain weapons that are provided to Ukraine, such as HIMARS, that are actually modified by the US so that they cannot reach into the Russian territory. And as you know, there are long-range, very effective missiles produced by Germany, which Germany does not want to give to Ukraine or share with Ukraine, because they're afraid that the Ukrainians are going to attack the targets. Incidentally, inside Russia, Putin was very specific about this. He gave an interview to his his favorite talk show host, Dmitry Kiselyov, a total propagandistic mad dog. Incidentally, if you remember, 10 years ago, he said that Russia could turn the US into a heap of radioactive ash. So Putin sat down with his favorite media guy, and among other interesting things, he said that look at the Crimean Bridge, right? Of which he's very proud, built with untold billions of trillions of rubles. The Ukrainians tried to sabotage it, but Putin specifically said, well, look at, basically he said, Germany is correct not to give Ukraine those missiles, because if the Germans do share those missiles with Ukraine, and Ukraine hits the Kerch Bridge, we would consider this a German attack by implication on the Russian territory. So these types of threats clearly work, and as I said, the HIMARS missile systems that the US gives to Ukraine are modified. In other words, we don't just rely on Ukrainian promises. We want to be certain that they cannot hit Russian targets, and this is very effective. And of course, I mean, on top of the fights in Congress, as you know, what's happening, we can't even, in the House of Representatives, we can't even put to a vote the assistance to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan at this point, because it's tied to specific domestic immigration issues. So between those two, it works.
Great. Next question is, have you seen anything unique or notable from Putin in response to Sweden's official admission to NATO?
To which Finnish official?
To Sweden's official admission.
Sweden. Oh, yes. So in that same interview with Dmitry Kiselyov, Putin played kind of an injured innocence. I mean, we had such terrific relationship with Finland and Sweden, and why would they do such a silly, dangerous thing? But we still hope that they'll come to their senses, and even though within NATO, and we still hope to more or less have good relationship with them. In other words, they're not yet part of the irredeemably evil West that's led by the United States. There's sort of some hope for Sweden and Finland. But clearly he actually, at the time, he was a bit insouciant about this. He said, well, they want to join NATO. Well, it's every country's right. But I think now he's beginning to realize that that's not that innocuous as he thought.
So we're coming up on time. So I sort of want to close by giving you an opportunity. You do a lot of forecasting in the last chapter of the book. And is there anything you would change or elaborate on the forecasting that you sort of do as a final assessment in the book since it's been written, or since things have changed?
Make it less scary? No, I haven't seen anything that would make me change this rather, apocalyptic scenario that I have there. But then there's nothing in Putin's behavior that indicates that he is, he's back on Earth, that his speeches prior to this, pseudo election, and his speech after the election, absolutely no remorse, no changing of the course, towards full victory over the West. By the way, it's no longer just Ukraine, over the West, and he's constantly. In other words, there's no lowering of the stakes of this war. I mean, he could have gently sort of, shove it on the back burner and start, getting the troops out. But no, and in fact, he promised another attack in Ukraine, and so if that continues, and if the West, of course, keeps Ukraine fighting, then I think that scary scenario that I outlined, I think it might still be in play.
A very optimistic note for us to end on. But Dr. Leon Aron, thank you for joining us. Riding the Tiger. Really appreciate it and your time and all that you have to share with us. So thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thanks very much.